Hello, this is Vulturefire, and today's video is going to be a review of all of the new cards in Breach Wanderers version 5100. This will not be a review of all of the changes, but I will be talking about a few cards that existed in the last version but had substantially different text. There are quite a few changes that are kind of borderline between being a new card and being a rework of the old version, and for a lot of those, I will be talking about them in an upcoming video that is going over the card changes in a bit more detail. But for this one, I am just planning to talk through, I think, 44 cards that are new to this version, or have changed so much that they are functionally new. All right, so with that introduction out of the way, let's get started. First of all, we're going to be talking about the new generic cards. So the first set of 3 cards I want to talk about are all belong to a new category of card that does something that we hadn't had on before now, and that is summoning enemies. Now, in the last version, you may remember that we had several cards that were added that let you summon angry spirits. Now, you may think Angry Spirit and Vengeful Shade sound very, very close together, and they are somewhat synonymous, but the difference is Angry Shades get pointed at the enemy, and they make the enemy feel pain, and Vengeful Shades are pointed at you, and they make you feel pain. So, what is a Vengeful Shade? A Vengeful Shade, you'll notice that all 3 of these cards use that same word, summon one enemy Vengeful Shade. Just like the allied summons, a Vengeful Shade will do the same action every turn until it dies. Unlike Angry Spirits, these are enemies, and they will count as enemies for all purposes. They must be killed in order to end the fight. You attack them. You can attack them directly. They will not take damage from enemy attacks, and they will be attacking you. So the Vengeful Shades grow in strength depending on the area you summon them in. In Area 1, I believe they are 15 health, and they attack for 3x2 and then gain power 2 after they attack. So they will get more powerful if you leave them alive. In Area 2, they have 25 health, something like that. And they hit for like 5x2 and gain powerful 3. And then in Area 3, they attack for like 7x2 and gain powerful 4. So they scale up very, very quickly. So the important point of all this is that when you are summoning Vengeful Shades, the first question you have to ask is, how am I killing them? And the second question that you're going to ask is, am I getting enough from the upside of this card to justify running it? And that can be a bit tricky. Now, there are some advantages to bringing your own enemies in a bottle. The first of them is if you have any cards that have on-kill triggers, these are a way to make it easier to hit those. So if you have something like a Lust for Blood or a Essence Harvest that normally might be very difficult to get value out of in like the Vessel fights in Area 1 or any of the Dragons in Area 2 or really any of the Area 2 mid-bosses either, summoning these cards will give you a way to take advantage of those still. If you can pick up items like Pirate Hook or Ancient Statuette, Pirate Hook giving you treasures when an enemy dies, or Ancient Statuette, which gives you powerful when an enemy dies, both of those work very well with these cards. The other thing is, these give you, because these are new enemies, they will have very low thresholds for statuses. So if you're a deck that gets value from proccing statuses, having these as targets is going to be valuable to you. So for example, Rowden's level 4 can be, you've stacked up status on a bunch of enemies. Rowden's level 4 will be very easy to hit on these new summons. The flip side of this, of course, is that they are still going to be a problem, and all of these cards do have a downside if you can't actually get the summon. And the reason you wouldn't be able to summon is that if there's no space for the summon, the enemy doesn't get summoned. So there can be room for up to 4 enemies. Summoned enemy. The Vengeful Shades are enemies, so they cannot use the new dedicated ally slot. So if there are already 4 enemies, or that includes, if there are 2 double white enemies or 1 double white enemy and 2 normal enemies, you will not be able to summon another spirit, another shade. And in that case, you will just have to suffer the downside. So, with all that preamble out of the way, let's talk through the cards themselves. So the first one is Accursed Ceremony. Accursed Ceremony is a common, and it lets you give Curse 4 to any enemy. This is a lot of curse. That is more curse than any other common will give you. Certainly way more curse than any other generic card is going to give you. And even once you get to monster cards, most of the cursed monster cards are now much got nerfed this patch. So like even Bane is only going to be 3 or 5, whereas this is 4 and 6. So this is a lot of curse. The downside is the Vengeful Shade. And so kind of the joke of this card, and what's going to make it tricky for you to use in a lot of cases, is that the kind of deck that wants to be setting up Curse as a win condition is also the sort of deck that doesn't really love creating an enemy that is going to be doing a lot of damage very quickly. So, if you apply Curse, you're playing Inna, and you're playing like Tank Inna, you put Curse 4 on the Vessel, and now you've got a problem because you still have to have damage to kill the Shade, or it is absolutely going to tear through you. Now, you can use an Accursed Ceremony to curse the Shade that you created, but that creates a problem. And if you can't create a Shade, because say you've played a Accursed Ceremony on the Vessel, and then you played a Accursed Ceremony on the Shade, and then you played a Accursed Ceremony on the Shade, then you get Curse 2 for yourself. So that's not a great solution. So where is this best used? I think Salon can get some use out of it, because Scattered Mod is a card that you're already in Salon going to be using a lot to deal AoE damage, and Accursed Ceremony will let you. So the problem that Salon tends to have early on is that if you are built around the cannons, the Arcane falls off pretty hard against the Vessels, and you can find yourself in this awkward position where closing out, you get through the first half of the Vessel's health pretty quick, and then closing out the fight becomes more of a challenge. Accursed Ceremony can help because the Shades won't have enough health to build up resistance to your Arcane detonations. And so you can play Accursed Ceremony, you play Scattered Mod. Scattered Mod kills the Shade, the Shade that you created, and then you get level 7 Salon Arcane detonation damage, splash damage onto the Vessel, and you've got full curse on the Vessel, and you played the card you're going to play anyway. And it's just all upside. So that's the main place I would use it, is I think Salon gets a lot of use out of it. If you're playing another deck that has a lot of AoE, I could see somehow fitting it in, but the awkward position you're going to find yourself in is that it is a summon card. It is a common, and a lot of the good AoE is going to be gold rarity. So you're either putting this in your card pool. Oh, and this card tends to be best early. If I'm running it in Salon, I am probably looking to find a way to replace it before I get to Area 3, because Area 3 Vengeful Shades are no joke. So I would not want to be carrying an Accursed Ceremony into Area 3, and I'm certainly not interested in committing an upgrade to it for the same reason. I think that you run Accursed Ceremony early, and then I think you cut it once you don't need it anymore, once you have another way to handle the role that it is filling for you. The exception to this would be if you have picked up a Pirate Hook or a Ancient Statue that will give you more value out of that curse effect. So hopefully that gives you an idea of where I'm going to be looking at for evaluating the others. Forbidden Rites is is kind of similar in a lot of ways. So Forbidden Rites is a pretty straightforward proposition. You get 8 mana. In exchange, fight a Shade. And so This one is a lot easier to sort of figure out the value of, because it's very simple. Can you kill a shade for less than 6 mana? Ideally, less than 4 mana, because if you spend 6 mana on it, then this is not very good. So if you play Forbidden Rites, and then you play an Aetherstorm and that cleans up the shade, you've had a great deal, because you functionally didn't have a downside at all. You were going to play that Aetherstorm. And now you have gotten all of the value from the Aetherstorm that you were getting anyway, and you're up a bunch of extra free mana. The downside, of course, is that Aetherstorm is also a gold card, so now you're looking at lining up 2 perfect gold cards together. This is again where Salon Scattered Mod comes into play, because Scattered Mod is just an incredibly powerful AoE attack at commons. You can just guarantee you'll have access to it. But that is the choice that I would make. So Forbidden Rites is a card that I have tried off and on throughout beta, and it is a card that I think has a lot of potential, but is very easy to play and then end up spending all of the mana that you got on just killing the shade, or spending enough of the mana that you got on killing the shade that you haven't really gotten anywhere. And the epic slots are tight enough in this patch that I don't think Forbidden Rites is going to make the cut most of the time. I think that you are going to be better off running increasing mana or Mana Eruption, or the card that we're going to talk about later, which is Spry Vigor, which is another new epic mana card, rather than Forbidden Rites. And Mystic Shadowblast, I think, is just bad. Because the problem... So Mystic Shadowblast summons an enemy Vengeful Shade, and if you can't, you apply 10 Arcane to yourself. And then you deal... And the actual effect of the card is to deal 20 damage to any enemy and apply 20 Arcane to it. And the reason I think Mystic Shadowblast is bad is that once you get... So committing a gold pick... Committing both a gold slot and a gold pick to a card is a high cost. So if you are putting Mystic Shadowblast in your deck, it is taking up a spot that could have gone to Singularity, could have gone to Aetherstorm, could have gone to just a really good mana card, a really good defensive card. There are a lot of options for very powerful cards that you could be using in that spot, is the point. And Mystic Shadowblast, 5 mana for 20 damage, 20 Arcane, that's pretty good. Like if that was all it was just like 5 mana, 20 damage to any enemy and apply 20 Arcane to it, that would be fantastic. But it's not. It's creating an enemy Vengeful Shade that in area 3, once you get... So the big thing to me is, with Accursed Ceremony, I mentioned with Accursed Ceremony, I am fine with playing it with a plan of cutting it. Mystic Shadowblast, though, I do not want to be committing a gold card pick to a card that I want to cut before area 3. And when you get to area 3, Mystic Shadowblast is a disaster. It is a card that that creates a problem that is equivalent to what you got from playing it. You're paying 5 mana to functionally break even. Worse than break even a lot of the time, because you are, unless this is getting the kill on an enemy, it is... if you're not killing the enemy outright with Mystic Shadowblast, then you are still taking damage from the original enemy, and now you're taking damage from the shade. And Mystic Shadowblast, it's going to be less damage than the amount of health that the shade that popped up in area 3 is worth. Which means it's just not a great deal. I do not like Mystic Shadowblast. I think it is bad. I think you shouldn't take it. I think you shouldn't play it. I think that it needs to be So the big thing to me with it, so I mentioned why it's different from Accursed Ceremony. The reason it's different from Forbidden Rites is that different decks can get different things out of that 6 mana. I mentioned that you can go Forbidden Rites Aetherstorm and you're really happy. The thing is that Mystic Shadowblast doesn't have that sort of, like, you could go Mystic Shadowblast into Aetherstorm, but Mystic Shadowblast didn't do anything to help you with Aetherstorm. And if you don't have the Aetherstorm follow-up, Mystic Shadowblast is just going to be bad. Whereas, like, if you go Forbidden Rites and you don't have exactly the Aetherstorm, you could potentially follow it up with something else to make up for it and still potentially have a bunch of mana in reserve. Mystic Shadowblast is trading. So basically, Forbidden Rites is letting you trade having to deal with an enemy for having more mana now, whereas Mystic Shadowblast is like trading damage to an enemy for health of an enemy. Damage to an enemy for more health on a new enemy. And that is just not a great trade ever, I think. I could be wrong. It's possible there are decks that are going to be great in, but my initial impression of it, from having played with it some, is that it is not a card, especially again with how tight your epic card pools are going to be, is that you're not going to find space for it. And if you do try and find space for it, you're usually going to be disappointed. The only exception would be if you were somehow like trying to do some quirky all-in on enemy summons deck. You were trying to do something with that. I don't think we have the support for that quite yet, but if that was something you were interested in trying, then obviously that's a reason to use it. All right, so I think that is enough of a summary for these. Forbidden Rites will be showing up again later, because I think I brought it up on the mana page next. Yeah, because I wanted to make sure that I still had it on screen, because we have two other new epic mana cards, Twinning Ritual and Spry Vigor. So there are three total. We already talked about Forbidden Rites for quite a while. Spry Vigor is you gain 2 mana, then you gain 3 additional mana if you have no fatigue. And then Spry Vigor Plus is 3 mana, 5 additional mana if you have no fatigue. So this is 5 or 8 mana if this is among the first cards you draw in a turn. This is very, very good. It has the obvious points of comparison are increasing mana and mana eruption. I think mana eruption is the easier comparison, because mana eruption is more likely to be competitive with Spry Vigor on the first time you play it in terms of mana gain. And so I would, directly comparing the two, pick mana eruption over Spry Vigor in any deck that is going to have any amount of growth gain, because I think you are likely to, especially if you're the sort of person who's going to be running enough mana that you can count on picking up a max mana from Arrest, or if you know which event options to take to get more max mana, getting 4 to 5 mana out of mana eruption is very, very easy a lot of the time, and there will be a lot of runs where you're easily getting more than that later in a fight. Even despite that, Spry Vigor is very powerful. Even if you have a lot of card draw, the fact that your worst case scenario is that it still gains 2 mana makes it reasonable. And even if you have a lot of card draw, you have 10 cards you could draw before Spry Vigor gets turned off, 5 from your initial opening hand, and then 5 before you get to the first fatigue stack. And in that case, that is a lot of room to find the Spry Vigor and get that extra mana. I think increasing mana is going to be better in very, very draw heavy decks, or decks that are particularly small. If you're aggressively removing cards, I'm lazy. Removing cards takes thinking. But if you are aggressively removing cards, increasing mana is going to probably be better than Spry Vigor, because you're more likely to both have fatigue when you draw it, and more likely to play it enough times that you are getting 5 or more mana from the increasing mana anyway. But Spry Vigor is still very good. I like having 2 epic mana cards in my mana pool, and very, very often it is going to be Spry Vigor and Mana Eruption, or Spry Vigor and increasing mana. So Spry Vigor is showing up in a lot of my card pools right now, I think. The other one, Twinning Ritual. And I am talking about them backwards. I know Twinning Ritual is sort of in the position where you would think I would talk about it first, but look, words. Twinning Ritual is gain 2 mana, create a temporary copy of the next 1 non-temporary spell you play this turn, or when it's upgraded, you gain 2 mana, you create a temporary copy of the next 2 non-temporary spells you play this turn. So the reason this is non-temporary is because in beta we had way too much fun with using it to play the same spell 3 times in a row, which was, or even more, because if you have multiple Twinning Rituals, you could potentially play the same spell a lot, because you'd keep getting temporary copies of it. So you would, I mentioned Salon, you get a Scattered Blast Plus, and then you would play the same Scattered Blast Plus 5 times in a row because you played 2 Twinning Ritual Pluses, and this was slightly unfair. So you can't do that anymore. Sorry, this is another thing the beta players have ruined for you. But it is still an incredibly good card. I will say, though, it is only kind of a mana card. And what I mean by that is that if you play Twinning Ritual, you're probably going to play a spell that costs more than, and spells are going to cost you more than 0 mana most of the time, and they're often going to cost you 2 or more mana. So if you play Twinning Ritual, and then you play a spell, you're kind of obligated to play that copy, right? Because why are you playing Twinning Ritual if you're not planning to play the copies it makes? Why wouldn't you just play, if you aren't planning to play your Twinning Ritual copies, just play Increasing Mana or Mana Eruption or Spry Vigor? So in that sense, Twinning Ritual is a discount on the, Twinning Ritual being a mana card makes it a discount on the copy it makes. So you can think of it effectively as a regrowth that costs -2 mana but only works on spells. Is a kind of silly way to think about it. But it is potentially a very powerful card. You will it is the sort of card where you sort of know based on that explanation whether or not you want it. So, if you know that your deck doesn't have spells, you don't want Twinning Ritual. If you know that your deck has spells but can't afford to double cast them usually, you don't want Twinning Ritual. If your deck can double cast its spells, you want Twinning Ritual. If you are playing, like, you Twinning Ritual in Aetherstorm, Drakes don't like that. Drakes don't like that at all. Lots of enemies don't like that at all. You Twinning Ritual into Aetherstorm or Twinning Ritual into, if you're playing a super big mana Rauden deck, there are very few things quite as satisfying as Twinning Ritualing a Singularity and just erasing something from existence. Or erasing 2 things from existence. Or you play Lingering Ritual and you get you Twinning Ritual, Lingering Ritual, and whoo boy, no enemies in the game are fans of that. They just die. They just have a bad time with that. Twinning Ritual is, and worst case scenario, it is the best sort of conditional card in that if you draw Twinning Ritual and you don't have a spell to go with it, you still get 2 mana. And you know what? That's fine. You're not sad about that. You draw Regrowth at the wrong time, especially now that Regrowth can't get back mana cards. You draw Regrowth at the wrong time, and Regrowth does nothing. You draw Twinning Ritual at the wrong time, and it's cool. It did something. It helped you play whatever else you did that turn. Cool. We're good. It didn't give you as much mana as another mana card would have, but that's fine, because when it's doing its full thing, it is doing amazing things. So Twinning Ritual is very, very good. Spry Vigor is very, very good. Forbidden Rites is conditionally good in the right decks. So that's your summary of these. Let's keep talking about mana cards. So one of the big things that happened with this set of new cards is that I and other players had noted that there were a lot of scenarios where you would build your deck and you would find yourself, regardless of what deck you were building, just putting in the same mana cards every single time. The number of card pools I built before this patch that just immediately had Mana Eruption and Increasing Mana was kind of ridiculous. Every card pool had at least one of the two, and most of them had both. And now we actually have decisions to make there. And the rare mana we got, some of it helps a little bit. We did get some mana that's kind of competitive with what we had, but I do think overall we didn't get quite as much variety at the rare mana slot as I would have liked. Just because part of it is like you need so many card pool non-epic mana cards, because I want like 6, probably 7, which means that even if we have a few more good ones, that largely just means that the decks that don't have mana that works specifically for them are going to have be taking fewer mana cards that they are unhappy with. But that's all kind of a digression. That's what I'm looking for. The main point here is that we have some new mana cards. So let's start with Incandescent Focus, because Incandescent Focus is the easiest one to talk about. You get 2 mana, you get 3 more mana if the enemy has 5 or more burn ranks. Guess what? You know when you're building your card pool whether you want this. It's very simple. Can your deck put 5 or more burn ranks on an enemy? Yes, you want this card. No, you don't want this card. It's that easy. This is just incredibly straightforward. You're a burn deck, You want it, you're not a burn deck. You don't want it, 5 or more burn ranks is a level of commitment that means that you're not getting there unless you are the burn deck. Especially because it has to be on the same enemy. You're not going to get there by just like random incidental burn. Maybe K'Tan can. Even K'Tan can potentially struggle to hit 5, even with his level 7 passive, but that's at least a case where you might want it. But this is Icy Concentration for the burn deck, and it is very, very good in the burn deck and completely pointless outside of it. There's never a reason, unless you are so early in the game that like this was in your first pack, and so you're just like putting this in because you might hit 5 burn maybe, and you don't have any other mana cards, and I just said that you want 6 of them, so I guess you're running Incandescent Focus. But outside of that, no, you're not running this if you're not in the burn deck. All right, that's way too many words to spend on saying one very simple thing. Next up, Ritual of Runes. So Ritual of Runes is in some ways reminiscent of Blazing Ritual in that it is a mana card that costs you a lot of mana and then just gives you more mana than you spend on it. So the important thing is, even though it does cost mana up front, it is a mana card. It's not affected by fatigue. You will always be net positive on your mana out of Ritual of Runes, but it's always only going to be a +2, and then +3 when upgraded. So the other thing it does, though, is it increases the damage of the top spell in your deck or discard pile by 25%. So the obvious downside here, so that's a relatively powerful effect. If it was 0 cost, gain 2 mana, increase the damage of the top spell in your deck or discard pile by 25%, that would be a pretty easy inclusion in almost any deck that cared about spells, because that is potentially, gain 2 mana and gain like 3 to 4 damage, probably. Sometimes more. If you get it on a singularity, that's potentially a lot of damage. It's like on a singularity, it's like 10 plus damage, 12 plus damage, whatever. But on a card that you're going to start with, something that's going to be like 10 to 12 damage on your spell, it's going to be much lower end, but still not bad. But the fact that it costs 6 mana does mean that, similar to Blazing Ritual, you're going to need to make sure you can hit that threshold, and that's not every deck is going to be able to do that. Especially if you're playing around Focus. If you are a deck that has 2 copies of Focus in your starting deck, I would be very, very hesitant about including Ritual of Runes, because if you are in that position, Focus, until upgraded, is going to really want you to be playing around 0 to 4 mana, and so having something that costs 6 can be very awkward. That said, pretty strong utility card. I think it is a card that is going to that's going to be difficult to evaluate how much it's doing for you in a lot of cases. So you kind of will just have to play with it and see how often it's getting stuck in your hand where you can't play it. Rowden has the easiest time with it, because once Rowden has 12 growth, which is going to be very easy, then Rowden will every turn guaranteed be able to have at least 6 mana to work with. So if it's in his opening hand, he will always be able to play it. Other characters are not going to have as easy of a time with that. Oh, and Rowden is also more likely to have those big spells that it gets value on. Characters like Salon and Inna can play decks that will use it. I would be more hesitant to use it on somebody like Drophis or K'Tan, who are more likely to be playing around that 0 mana fatigue point. Or sorry, not fatigue, focus point. But it's not the worst. I could see using it there. It is worth remembering, though, it is only ever +2 mana. So you need to be getting value out of that extra damage, or you would be better off playing even like an Arms Race that you're never drawing cards off of, because the Arms Race will never get stuck in your hand. Weary Concentration. Or let's go with Tyrannical. Let's talk about Tyrannical Focus, because it's the other conditional one. So Tyrannical Focus, first of all, it gives you Predator 1. Predator is a keyword that we had previously. It changed very slightly, but I'm just going to explain what the current version is, because I feel like if you, even if you had seen Predator before, you either don't, because it's only on a single monster card in Area 3, you either don't remember what it does, or you may have just assumed it already worked like this, which is that When you have Predator and you attack an enemy, you deal 10% extra damage to that enemy for each unique debuff that enemy has. So if the enemy has Poison 5, that's still only one debuff, and that one debuff is Poison, so you get plus 10% damage for attacking that enemy. If the enemy has Poison and Weak, you get plus 20%. If the enemy has Poison and Weak and is Vulnerable, you get 30% from Predator and 30% from Vulnerable. So that's fun. That opens up a new kind of... we got a lot of cards that changed this patch as well to give you Predator, so you can now build a deck around this new Predator buff and then figure out which grab bag of random debuffs is going to be the most effective for you in order to effectively up your Predator bonus and get, plus 30 to 50 damage out of Predator and go to town. So Tyrannical Focus, that's the first thing, is that it is a free way to get 1 stack of Predator. Hooray! On top of that, you choose any enemy, you gain 2 mana if it's vulnerable, 2 if it's weak, 2 if it's frail. So frail is going to be the most difficult one to set up there. You really have to make a concerted effort to get frail set up. We got a couple cards changed, and one that we'll talk about later gives frail, and there are a few cards that were changed to give frail. But frail is still overall a fairly rare debuff. Sorry, yawning. A very rare debuff to be able to put out. But if you can, it's decent. I would only put Tyrannical Focus in the pool if I had access to both Vulnerable and Weak in my starting deck, but that's not too difficult. You do want to be sure every time you play Tyrannical Focus that you're going to be getting at least 2 mana out of it. This is a pretty sad card if you're not, and you want to be getting 4 mana out of it more often than not. If you're not getting at least 4 mana out of your Tyrannical Focus, or if you're not getting 4 mana out of it regularly enough, you're going to want to probably just have a different mana card that doesn't have the risk of hitting 0. But the fact that this does now give Predator, when this originally hit beta, it didn't have the Predator line. Adding that Predator, I think, makes it a lot more viable, because it means that even if you're only getting 2 mana, you're still getting more than, it's still better than just like Arms Race. Again, that theoretical Arms Race with no strikes, where you're just getting 2 mana and literally doing nothing else. Tyrannical Focus is going to be better than that. And so I think it's fine in a lot of decks, and it is great in the dedicated Predator decks that are going to be getting always the Vulnerable and the Weak and often the Frail. 6 mana is a lot of mana to potentially get. But yeah, that's trying out with Tyrannical Focus. Weary Concentration is very, very good. So you gain 4 mana, you gain Fatigue 1. So the first note here is this does not reset your fatigue counter. So if you draw 5 cards and you play Weary Concentration, you are still only 1 card away from the next fatigue stack. So that's something to keep in mind. That is a downside. It would be better. It would be a stronger card if it hit you to the next fatigue stack, because then you could draw 5 cards, play Weary Concentration, and then you're now at 1 fatigue and 5 cards from the next one. And that's not how it works. But regardless of that, the main trick with Weary Concentration is you're going to hold it in your hand until you have played as much of your card draw as you can, and then you're going to play Weary Concentration, and you're going to use it to play the cards that you were drawing to. And if that's what you're doing with it, it's very, very good. Having just 4 mana unconditionally, every time you play, you get 4 mana. It has a downside, but it is a downside that is, as these things go, incredibly manageable for almost all decks. It can't eat your purity stacks. It cannot kill. It cannot blow you up. It cannot deal damage to you in any way or make enemies deal damage to you. It'll give you a Vengeance stack on Catan. It's just very straightforward gaining mana. And Weird Concentration Plus is kind of nonsense. 8 mana and Fatigue 2 is ludicrous for a silver mana card. And I think I have been underrating that upgrade when I have been playing with it. But, wow. Of course, once you've gained 8 mana, you probably want to draw cards. And when you gain Fatigue 2, you really don't want to draw cards. But even with that taken into account, That's just so much mana. That is so close to, again, paying for a singularity. And that's pretty good. You can go Weird Concentration in a Ritual of Runes. You can pay for singularity and still have 1 mana left over to pay for, Fatigue 1, but not Fatigue 2. So, draw it first. But yeah, so of these, to recap, Weird Concentration, you're probably putting in every single card pool once you unlock it. Ritual of Runes, you're putting in card pools for especially Rowden and especially spell heavy decks on other characters, but not everyone wants it. Tyrannical Focus, I think, is going to often end up on characters like Drophus or Merle, who are more likely to be playing around Vulnerable and Weak. And Inna has a Vulnerable Weak Frail sub-theme, so she's more likely to use it. Incandescent Focus, you're playing in burn decks, period. End of story. Maybe Catan level 7. All right. Finally, we're almost done with just the mana. We have Patient Focus and Spark. These are cards that existed before, but changed significantly. Patient Focus used to be 2 mana and then extra mana if it was the last card in your hand. Now it is just 5 mana, but then after you play, you lose 1. After you gain that 5 mana, you lose 1 mana per card in your hand. So if it's the last card in your hand, it does give you 5 mana straight up, because it counts after it is. When you play it, it doesn't count itself. So yeah, if it's the last card in your hand, 5 mana. Very good for a common. That makes it the absolute most mana you can get from any common, not counting. Okay, no, that's not strictly speaking true. Infected Focus against 3 or 4 enemies can get that much, and Void Focus can get that much after increasing it several times. But in general, that's more mana than you're going to get from most of the common mana cards. The flip side to this is that if you are, especially if you're on, like, say, Drophus, who's going to, start the turn, Drophus or Inna, who will start the turn having created cards, you're going to have a lot worse time. You can find yourself, especially if you're, like, drawing cards, if you're the sort of person who will desperation draw, you're starting to run up on fatigue, so you just, like, play all your card draw, just, like, hope that you find mana. This is not the mana you want to find when you are at, 8 cards in your hand. Because it is anti-mana at that point. It absolutely can. If you have too many cards in hand when you play it, it will just lose you mana straight up. So, maybe don't do that. But it's a card that I don't like. I don't like personally using. I think it's a good card if you are good at thinking through your turns effectively, but I'm not. Really, it is a worthwhile card as long as you can consistently play it while you have 2 other cards, only 1 or 2 other cards in hand with it. Because if you're getting 3 mana from it regularly enough, that makes it, on par with a Resolute Focus, for example. But I personally think it takes way too much thinking relative to like a Resolute Focus or a regular Focus or a Gambler's Focus. So I'm going to tend to lean towards those. But it's definitely not a bad pick if you like thinking through stuff. If you're playing a discard deck that isn't just the sort of discard deck that's trying to draw a lot of cards, Patient Focus is now easier to line up than it was. The problem that it had before was you would end up with these awkward hands where it's like you can discard down, and now the 2 cards you have left in your hand are the Patient Focus and a Siphon card, and it's like, well, guess I'm not getting the Patient Focus bonus. And now it's easier to line that up properly. Spark used to be, I think, just like apply shock, and that was it. I think it was like apply shock, and then if the enemy was shocked, apply like burn 1 or something. Now, you apply 4 shock to any enemy, and then you gain 3 mana if an enemy is shocked. The important note here is Spark does not have to do the shocking. If the enemy is shocked if any enemies were already shocked, whether they were the one you targeted or not, Spark will get you the mana. This is an interesting little card because it is a free way to output an amount of shock that is somewhat negligible, but that can scale up fairly well with, especially if you upgrade your Spark, then it's going to scale pretty well with Adapt or other bonuses, and it will do pretty good work with items that are going to give you plus status applied or plus shock applied, especially. The downside, of course, is that if you don't have other shock sources, this is not going to do much for you, and it's rarely going to get you mana. 3 mana is also a low enough number that I am not happy to be playing this unless I expect that 4 shock to do something. If I'm not getting any value out of that 4 shock, I'd rather just play a safer mana card that's going to get me that 3 mana up front, rather than risk having this, because obviously if it didn't give you the mana, then it didn't shock something. And so it's done basically nothing for you at that point, which spending 0 mana to do nothing is better than spending 1 mana to do nothing, but it's still not exactly great. So I am cautiously optimistic on this card in the right decks. I'm just not certain that it is that sort of card that's in that awkward spot where even in the decks that want it, it's not going to be exciting, and the decks that don't want it really don't want it. And that's not, in my opinion, a great place for cards like this to be. If a card is going to be niche, if it's only going to work in one deck, I would like it to be able to shine in that deck. Now, I don't think Spark clears that bar. So I would, generally speaking, there are decks where I will run Spark, but I don't think there's any decks where I'm happy about it. So that's my notes there. Spark Plus is a lot better because 8 shock is a lot easier to get to 10. But then it does cost 1 more. So you notice it goes up to 5 mana, but it's really only going up to +1 mana and +4 shock for your upgrade, which isn't super exciting either. If this was straight up 8 shock and you get 5 mana, now that's worth committing an upgrade. And now I am more interested in taking a Spark with a plan to upgrade into a Spark Plus. But with that upgrade being only 4 mana, which is fine, but nothing to write home about. And the fact that it still will need help to get that shock, even the first shock on the enemy, means that I think that I am going to tend not to want Spark in a lot of cases. And there's still this sort of odd deck with shock cards where you're just playing a bunch of shock cards like Shocking Blast and Spark and a few others that are like you're playing bad shock cards because, if you spend enough cards doing fractional amounts of shock, you'll get to shock things. And I just don't. I'd rather just play cards that do things, I don't want to play multiple cards to do 1 card worth of effect when I could just play 2 cards that each do, that combine to do 2 cards worth of effect, All right, so that's the mana out of the way. Let's talk about cleanse options. So these cards, look at them, love them. They're going in all your card pools. End of story. Thank you for your time. You just need them. That's how it works. So one of the big changes this patch, Purity got nerfed. The Purity itself did not change, but almost all of the Purity granting cards got nerfed. I believe Peace of Mind escaped unscathed, and then almost everything else either doesn't grant Purity at all anymore, or if it did grant Purity 2 unupgraded, now it's only granting Purity 1 until you upgrade it. And if it costs less than 4 mana, it probably doesn't. If it did before, it doesn't now. So Blessed Strike is now 4 mana. It does 5x2 damage. You get Purity 1. It used to be 2 mana for 3x2 and Purity 1. Revelation is unchanged. That's the Wits 8 and Purity 1. But in general, Purity is expensive. And because Purity is expensive, but you still need to be able to deal with enemy debuffs, Cleanse has risen to fill the gap. And now it is possible to cleanse multiple stacks in one go. Because if you have Cleanse is 25% rounded, which means that if you are at 6 or more stacks, you'll cleanse off 2. If you're at 10 or more stacks, you'll cleanse off 3, and so on. So the flip side of this is that you will need a lot of cleanse in order to manage Curse, especially against like the Hollow Maw fight, or sorry, Hollow Maw, Dread Maw, whatever it's called. The Maw fight in Area 3, or the Vessel fight in Area 3, or the 2x Slime, 2x Wisp fight in Area 3. If you're not a very fast deck, you're going to need a lot of cleanse. Or against Demented Munchroom, you'll want to have Cleanse against Demented Munchroom because that fight got harder to kill quickly. If you're fighting Poison Golems, or Bog Golems, rather is what they're called, you're going to want Cleanse. So there are a lot of fights where you're going to want Cleanse, and in all of those fights, having multiple Cleanse is a good thing. Also, if you're not going to have Purity, then having like the ability to cleanse twice helps against having Bleed put on you by Nathas, having Arcane Leak put on you by Arcane Wisps, stuff of that nature. So you're going to want Cleanse. There are 4 total Cleanse cards, but Cleansing Shield didn't really change. It's now 3 mana instead of 2, and it gives more shield, but otherwise it's the same card it always was, so I didn't see a point in including it here. Dispel Magic became Arcane Silence, which the reason that it changed is that, and I noticed now that I have Arcane Silence and Arcane Silence Plus flipped from how I have the other cards, but Dispel Magic used to be you cleanse yourself once and then you dispel 1 all enemies, and then Dispel Magic Plus was 3 mana for cleanse yourself twice and dispel 2 all enemies. And the problem with this was it made some fights a bit too easy. Being able to just straight up double dispel things like Emerald Dragon or Shadowbone Protector kind of trivialized those fights in a lot of ways. And so that's why this changed. It is now AoE Arcane, which is going to be stronger for some decks because this is going to trigger detonations. This will make it a damaging card, which means that one of the problems that Dispel Magic would have sometimes is that you would play it and it would do nothing or close to nothing. And Arcane Silence is much less likely to have that happen. You're much more likely to play Arcane Silence and then get to actually blow up stuff and get damage out of it, which is nice. Especially if you're playing Rauden or Paladin or Salon, and so you have advantages to tripping Arcane explosions thanks to passives. But even if you don't, so the big note here is if you are not playing with Adapt and you don't upgrade Arcane Silence, or especially if you don't upgrade Arcane Silence, you are not going to be able to consistently detonate or dispel in all cases. Forest Guardian, for example, in Area 1, stacks plated, and you're not going to be able to detonate the first time. It has 1 plated to begin with, so you're not going to be able to detonate that plated on the first play of Arcane Silence unupgraded without Adapt. And you're not going to be able to do it. And then, of course, even once you've done it once, the second time is going to be even harder. So that's worth keeping in mind. But Arcane Silence is now even better than Dispel Magic was against the Drakes in Area 2. So if Drakes are a problem for you, this card is now even better than it was. It's unlocked by default, so you just always have it. It is, if you are going to drop a cleanse option, though, it's going to be Arcane Silence, and it's going to be because you don't think you'll be able to consistently get value out of the Arcane. Sanctity is 4 mana, you draw 3, you cleanse yourself 1 time, and you lose 1 curse. And you upgrade it, and it still is draw 3, and you cleanse yourself twice and lose 2 curse. Which means that Sanctity Plus is the way to solve your curse problems, especially with cleanse having gotten nerfed twice now. It is buffed from where it was last patch, but the percentage has gone down a couple times during beta. But so if you want to be able to deal with curse, Sanctity is your card. And card draw 3 for 4 mana isn't exceptional, but it's certainly not bad. That is only slightly below rate. And most of the other options for drawing 3 cards that are the same cost or less, that are generic cards regardless of rarity, come with some downside of some kind. So Sanctity Plus having upside instead of downside just immediately makes it a worthwhile consideration. And the fact that it is an upside that will help you in so many of the most important fights means that I am very happy to have multiple copies of Sanctity most of the time. I will always take 1, and I will usually be happy to take 2. And I will almost always upgrade at least 1 of them, especially if I'm fighting Ruby Dragon in Area 1. Sorry, if I'm fighting Ruby or Shadowbone in Area 2, or if I'm fighting Maw in Area 3 as my boss, then I will really want to have a Sanctity Plus. Sanctuary is notable because it is a card that will cleanse 2 without an upgrade, which is very, very good because there are a lot of enemies that will throw like weak 2 or vulnerable 2 or bleed 2 or arcane leak 2 on you, and Sanctuary cleans that off. Cleans off both stacks right away, no questions asked. The other note is, unlike Cleansing Shield, it does cleanse before it gives you shield. So to read off the full card, because in case anybody's just listening to it, Sanctuary is 4 mana for a skill that is silver rarity with cleanse yourself 2 times, you get tough 2 and 15 shield, and then you give 15 shield to all enemies. So this is an outstanding defensive card. The fact that it gives you tough is an incredibly valuable defensive defensive buff. Cleanse is an incredibly powerful way to clean off things like vulnerable or frail that were going to make your ability to defend harder. And then 15 shield to all enemies is whatever. That is a downside, but if you're not playing a very aggressive deck, that in order for that to be a downside that is relevant, you have to be playing a deck that is so aggressive that you need to be able to get those kills now. Because 15 shield is not that much once you get later on in the game. Once you get to area 2 or 3, you're fighting enemies with like 150 health, 200 health. And at that point, 15 shield is nothing. But tough 2 and 15 shield for yourself, that's going to be something for the whole game. If you didn't have tough before, like if you are fighting Baylator, if Baylator has put vulnerable on you, and you weren't tough, this then removes a negative 30% damage buff on yourself, adds a plus 30% damage reduction, so removes you go from taking plus 30% damage to taking minus 30% damage, and you get 15 shield on top of that. And that's just an incredibly good value for 4 mana. The upgrade is a little bit more questionable. Cleanse yourself 3 times is better than cleanse yourself twice, but in a lot of cases, cleanse yourself twice is good enough. And gaining tough 3 is better than gaining tough 2, but Sanctuary is probably not your only tough source. So you don't necessarily need it to be tough 3, because you probably can have at least enough other tough that like Sanctuary plus the other thing will give you 100% uptime anyway. And 25 shield is nice, but 25 shield to all enemies is a pretty big downside. Because once you get to 25 shield, that is the point where you are having to expend noticeable effort to get through it, I think, especially if there are multiple enemies in the fight. That said, you don't have to upgrade Sanctuary. You can just play regular. You don't. The fact that it is an incredibly powerful defensive card that does not need an upgrade to be that powerful is worth a lot. Like, if you took off the cleanse yourself 2 times and it was just gain tough 2 and 15 shield and give 15 shield to all enemies, there are decks that would play that. And the cleanse yourself twice is incredibly relevant in a lot of fights. So yeah, Sanctuary is going in every single deck you build that isn't all in aggressive Khaton. It's that simple. Sanctity, you're even including an all in aggressive Khaton because it's card draw. Khaton is perfectly happy having that. Sanctity is S plus tier. I can't think of it. It was stronger. It used to be 3 mana instead of 4, but even at 4 mana, I would be hard pressed to imagine a deck that does not want it. So, moving on. New Frostbite support. So, Deathfrost Storm, you give Frail 1 and Curse 2 to one enemy. Any enemy, it's your choice. It's not the first enemy. It's Frail 1 and Curse 2 to any enemy. And you give Frostbite 3 to all enemies. So, this is AoE Frostbite. The Frostbite deck needed more ways to output Frostbite, especially AoE. This is a way to output AoE Frostbite. It's basically that simple. It is notable as a card that gives Curse 2 that is generic, but it's kind of expensive. It is a way to give Frail, but again, it's kind of expensive. But if you are playing a Predator deck, this is 3 debuffs onto one enemy, and they're relatively rare debuffs that you may not otherwise have especially in your generic card pool, so that's notable. And Frail in particular is noteworthy for turning on Tyrannical Focus, because Tyrannic Focus specifically will give you 2 mana if the enemy that you're hitting with it is Frail. So that's nice. But mostly you're playing Deathfrost Storm because you're the Frostbite deck, and you needed it because you needed AoE Frostbite, so you played the AoE Frostbite card. It's that simple. Glacial Touch. Glacial Touch, so you're going to trigger, is 2 mana, skill, trigger Frostbite 5 times on any enemy, and then if you do, you draw 5 and gain Purity 1. So this is the Frostbite payoff, and it is a heck of a payoff. This is 2 mana to draw 5 cards. Remember I said 4 mana to draw 3 cards was pretty good? This is better than that. This is drawing 5 cards and triggering Frostbite 5 times. That's 15 damage and 15 frost. That is a substantial amount. And you're getting Purity 1, just as a bonus. And if you upgrade it, and if you're taking this, you're upgrading it. It is a gold card, so you'll be able to upgrade it immediately. You're going to, instead of drawing 5, you're going to draw 7. You can get Purity 2, which is, and you're still only needing 5 Frostbite to do it, which is banana pants crazy. The flip side of this is, Frostbite 5 is a big ask. You need to be very dedicated to the Frostbite deck, and even if you are, you're often not going to be able to play more than 1 copy of this, and you may not be able to play it every time you draw it. Frostbite 5 is just such a massive commitment to the strategy that this is the payoff that Frostbite needed. But keep that in mind, it is a reward for commitment. So similar to Incandescent, even more than Incandescent Focus, this is a card, you put it in your deck, and you know when you're building your deck that this is a card you want. You might put Deathfrost Storm into a deck because you, for some reason, care about the Frail or the Curse. You're never putting Glacial Touch in any deck that isn't all-in dedicated Frostbite, because it won't do anything. So yeah, I'm going to pause for a moment before moving on, but you guys won't have the pause. All right. So the next thing, new ways to make monsters angry. So this is not quite a new mechanic. The hidden Dragonfly Rider boss, it's not really hidden, but it's just a very rare event boss, drops a card that triggers enemy actions. But this is we only now in this patch have gotten it more broadly on more cards. And so Goading Bolt is completely new. It does 16 damage. It is 0 mana for a spell that deals 16 damage to any enemy, and you trigger that enemy's action. Upgraded, it is 30 damage to any enemy and trigger its action. And so Careless Defenses gain 16 shield and tough 1. You trigger the action of any enemy. Upgrade is 24 shield and tough 2. You trigger the action of any enemy. So the first big note here is, what exactly does triggering an action mean? It means the enemy is going to do the things it would do on its turn, except it is not going to change what it's doing. It is not going to cycle its action. So whatever it is doing now, it will do again on its turn. And any debuffs it has that would, it doesn't cause debuffs to tick or buffs to count down or any of that. So if you use a Goading Bolt on an enemy that is cursed, it will not take the curse damage. So why would you use this? Well, there's a couple reasons. The first is Paladin, who is the new character, has a sub-theme of goading is the short name of this mechanic, because Goading Bolt and Goading Glare, and there are a few other cards that have the mechanic that have goad in the name. But so the idea is that Paladin gets benefits for blocking enemy attacks, and has ways to set up Reflect, which deals damage to enemies that deal damage to Paladin, and has counterattack, which gives you damaging cards for fully blocking. So you'll play Goading Bolt in Paladin decks because you are specifically wanting enemies to attack you. The other thing that happens to be very convenient is if an enemy is frozen, it doesn't get to do anything when you trigger its action. So if you're playing a frost-based deck, Goading Bolt is just free damage. Like literally free, in that it is 0 mana to play, and the enemy does not get to counterattack. And 16 damage is enough that the problem that a lot of the other free cards have is that sure they cost you no mana, but like I think Quip Shot now actually costs more mana to actually do damage, but you know, a lot of the cards that are zero mana to do damage don't do enough damage to be worthwhile. You know, like Jolt is 1 mana for 8 damage to an enemy, and you apply 4 shock to yourself. Like 8 damage is just not that much. 16 damage is twice as much as 8, and that means that it is at a point where it is relevant. And the fact that Goading Bolt Plus is 30 damage is absolutely very, very good. If you're playing a freezing deck, I would very strongly consider taking and upgrading a Goading Bolt, because that's just a lot of damage. The other important note here that is relevant for Goading Bolt is, you know who else doesn't get counterattack? It's enemies that are dead. If you play Goading Bolt on an enemy that has not enough HP to survive getting hit for 30 damage, you can't trigger its action because it's a corpse. So that's Goading Bolt. Careless Defense is slightly different. So the obvious difference between the two is that Goading Bolt works very well against frozen enemies, and Careless Defense kind of does, because they won't trigger their action. But also, if they're frozen, do you need 16 shield? Careless Defense, in general, is going to be the one that you want in a more dedicated counterattack deck, because 16 shield and then the upgrade of having 24 shield is enough that it will often, more than, especially in area 1 and 2, more than fully block the damage that's coming in, which means that it is going to be a net positive on shield, and you'll get all the benefits of fully blocking an enemy attack, and you'll have an extra stack of tough to work with. So that's why, so Careless Defense is actually a pretty good defensive card in that sense. Like, obviously 16 shield is a lot for 2 mana. If you're in a Frost deck that's not going to be freezing all of the enemies, it can still be good. It is also a card that can justify including, these Goading cards are another reason to use the Vengeful Shades that we were talking about earlier, because Vengeful Shades are not the safest things to goad, but because they do get fairly strong fairly quick, because they stack up, they're powerful so quickly. But especially in area 1 and 2, it is fairly safe to goad them once, as long as you're planning to not let them survive past like one more turn after that. And so having the Cursed Ceremony plus Careless Defense can be very useful against area 1 enemies, especially like the area 1 mid bosses. So you'll play Cursed Ceremony on the boss, and then you will Careless Defense the Shade, so that you don't have to Careless Defense the boss, and then you'll be fairly happy. These are both going to be fairly narrow. They are dangerous cards to use. They are difficult cards to use properly. They are cards that are very easy to mess up using and kill yourself with. They are cards that need a lot of game knowledge, because if you see an enemy that is doing a debuff, you need to know what that is. One thing that can be very fun is if an enemy is applying Doom to you, then having them apply more Doom to you is good, actually. So if you're fighting Shadowbone Dragon, or the Vessels, or the Vessels of Corruption, or Vessel of Knowledge, and you know which turn is the Doom turn, which for Vessel of Knowledge is easy because it's turn 1, but for other enemies you just kind of have to have learned where in the pattern that is. Then goading them into applying more Doom to you can be very, very beneficial for giving you the time you need in that fight. That said, these cards are not for the faint of heart, and they are not for players who are... They are going to be very weak if you don't have that game knowledge. So I would... If you heard that explanation of what triggered an enemy action does, and your thought was, that sounds like a bad idea, I don't want to do that, it's a good instinct. Stick with that. You're probably going to be safe for doing that. But these are cards that are a lot of fun. Anytime you can get value out of them, you get to feel really clever. They are very powerful in the right scenarios. So I think that it is a lot of fun to find places to use them. But, don't be surprised if it backfires and you die. But let's talk about ways to block angry monsters if you, for some reason, have decided to make all the monsters angry. So, first card here, Elemental Barrier. You gain 15 shield, Arcane Barrier 2, Frost Barrier 2, and Shock Barrier 2. You may recognize this card if you have played, if you have fought Shadowbone Protector. This used to be what Prismatic Shield did, although Prismatic Shield was 2 mana and a silver elite monster card from Area 3. So, it was 2 mana for 10 shield and the barriers. This one is 4 mana for 15 shield and the barriers. And then 20 shield and barrier 3 of each kind when you upgrade it. But Elemental Barrier is pretty good as a defensive card. The barriers are not going to be relevant in some fights, but not in a lot of the fights where you would most want them to be relevant. In general, I would only care about the barriers if you have other ways to apply the elements. You know, if you have, this can help you, if you're in Salon, it will help you like hit extra arcane procs, or in Routen, it can occasionally help you with hitting, getting the last like point you need to freeze like an Assault Wisp or similar. But in general, I wouldn't count on that being a huge part of it. However, having all 3 barriers does also mean you take 6 less status from status-based attacks. So that's nifty. So it is still a good amount of shield, a good amount of a solid defensive option. If you're playing a defensive deck, it is one of the better, because you have like this and you've got like charged shield. So if the aftershocks from charged shield aren't very appealing to you, Elemental Barrier is a pretty good card you could use instead. Chaotic Barrier, you gain shield equal to 33% of your maximum shield, and you apply 6 to 12 of a random status to any enemy, and it is 2 mana. So 33% of your maximum shield. On most characters, that's going to be like 3 to 4 shield if you aren't stacking Sturdy. So that's not very exciting. So without any buffs or debuffs in the equation, very often this will be 2 mana, gain 3 shield, apply an average of 9 of a random status to any enemy. That is not terribly exciting. But this is, if you have lots of Sturdy, then suddenly it can gain you amount of shield that's, somewhat respectable. Because if you have, 10 Sturdy, then that's, you've got, let's say 20 shield, max shield. Now you're getting 7 shield out of it, which for 2 mana that's fine. It's not great, but it's fine. And then if you have Adept, then you're getting like a little over 10 status. So you'll probably do something with it. That's not too bad. I think this card is, Chaotic Barrier, I think, is a card that suffers a lot from being a gold card in competition with other gold cards, because it needs a lot of setup to be enough shield to be relevant. So like if you're comparing Chaotic Barrier directly to our Elemental Barrier, it's going to be a lot harder to get Chaotic Barrier to be 15 shield. It's going to be a lot harder there will be times where it will apply enough status to be relevant, but there will also be times where it just like applies the wrong status, or it just doesn't apply quite enough. And you just don't get that much value out of it. And you just don't have control over it, which is can be annoying. You don't control what status you're going to get. You don't control exactly how much you're going to get. Paladin gets more use out of it than other characters, because Paladin's level 4 will give you a lot of Sturdy, and Paladins specifically, especially in supercharged mode, gets a lot of value out of that random status. So for those reasons, it can do good work on Paladin. But I think in general, Chaotic Barrier is a card that you are going to not quite find room in your 9 epics for. You're just going to end up running a charged shield instead, because it's just more reliable. You're going to run Elemental Barrier instead because it's more reliable. And then you're going to have your other spots already taken up with like Arcane Silence and Sanctity and 2 mana cards and whatever else. Unbreakable Hide. Unbreakable Hide is 3 mana. You gain Plated 8 this turn. Or Unbreakable Hide Plus is you gain Plated 12 this turn. So this is a weird card. And I haven't played with it because it changed a few times, and like the original version was very weak. This version though, there are fights in Area 3 where this just is 3 mana and the enemies just can't do anything to you this turn. And that's not bad. That's a pretty nice place to be, if we're being honest. Can't be sad about that. The fact that this shuts down prowlers and hunters and scouts is very good. It doesn't fully block out like Bayalators. Oh, and it'll shut down Marsh Elementals too, usually. It won't shut down like Bayalator hatchlings or other elites a lot of the time, but the number of things it does shut down is pretty notable. The problem is it's not particularly good against any of the bosses in the area. Watchers don't hit that much. Watcher of the Swarm doesn't hit you that hard. Watcher is usually more of like a fight to try and get this stupid thing dead through the summons. The Vessels of Corruption are going to be, the curse is going to be the problem. Like the actual damage the Vessels do is almost never going to be a real threat. They don't hit that hard and they don't scale up at all. It is just the curse that's the problem in that fight. So it doesn't do much there. It doesn't do anything in Area 2 against Emerald Dragon. It doesn't do really anything against Ruby Dragon. It's not going to do much for you against Chimera if you're shocked. It won't do that much for you against that other jerk. Against like Treants, it won't do that much. Because there'll be a lot of turns where it won't do anything. So it is very good in a few specific fights that you may not otherwise be able to handle. But the flip side of that is in a lot of the boss fights, especially like boss fights that you might struggle with, like Demented Munchroom, or Emerald Dragon, or Bayalator, or Maw, or Vessels of Corruption, it's not going to do really anything to help you. So that's something to keep in mind. That said, the fact that it can be such a literal lifesaver in other fights, you might want it in some decks that otherwise might struggle in those fights. Although, in general, I would say if you need Unbreakable Hide, I would rather make changes elsewhere in the deck to better handle those fights without relying on it. Because the fact that Unbreakable Hide is only this turn does mean relying on it means risking not drawing it on the right turn. And I don't love that. I that's a large part of like why I like tough and weak and actual shield gain with sturdy more, is that all of those things you can set up a turn in advance and be fine, whereas Unbreakable Hide has to be drawn on the turn you need it, and if it isn't, it's not going to go well. So yeah, that's that one. So now on to miscellaneous other new cards. So I had categories up until now, but I ran out of I ran out of ways to really thematically group the remaining cards, so they're just more cards. Echoing Bolt. 1 mana, deal 8 damage to any enemy, you draw 1, you create and discard 1 Echoing Bolt. Echoing Bolt Plus, you deal 12 damage to any enemy, you draw 1, you create and you discard 2 Echoing Bolt Plus. So Echoing Bolt is very funny. If you take it, you probably want to upgrade it. So for Echoing Bolt to be good, you need to have enough mana and good enough mana cards to support the fact that after a certain point in the fight, you're drawing only Echoing Bolts. And you need to be able to survive to the point in the fight where you are drawing mostly Echoing Bolts. And then the Echoing Bolts themselves are going to win you the fight. 12 damage is enough. And this is another one of those cards where, like, if you take it, you're upgrading it. 12 damage is absolutely enough to end the fight. To end most fights in a reasonable time frame, if you just keep playing it. And because it draws a card, you can keep drawing Echoing Bolts into more Echoing Bolts. Fatigue will slow you down very quickly, but it is quite a good time. It's kind of a meme card. The nice thing about it is, like, once you have an Echoing Bolt, you can cut all your other damage spells, all your other damage sources, because like Echoing Bolt is a 1-card win condition. A 1-card win condition that quickly becomes 60 cards. I have had Echoing Bolt wins where I did have like literally dozens and dozens of copies in my deck. I think I ended one fight with like 50 copies. I have a GIF of just clicking page after page of my draw pile that is just like 5 straight pages of Echoing Bolts. It's very funny. It is a card that it's hard to figure out what to play with, because like the nature of it is the card that you play with Echoing Bolt is Echoing Bolt, because sooner or later, because eventually that's the only card you're able to play. It's funny. It is a good card, but I don't know what deck you put it in besides whatever deck you want to put it in, and just like see what happens. I don't know what to tell you other than that. It's funny. Try it for yourself. Rupture Strike. Rupture Strike is 4 mana. Deal 2x4 damage to the first enemy. Gain powerful 1 this turn for every rank of powerful you have. And Rupture Strike Plus is 2 mana and deal 3x4 damage to the first enemy. You still only gain powerful 1 for every rank of powerful you have. So this is a fun card. You need to have some powerful to get it going. But the nice thing is, the upgraded version being just 3x4 damage straight up means that you don't need that much for it to be fine. Like, paying 2 mana to deal 3x4 damage to the first enemy, that is entirely reasonable. That's a card you're usually going to be fine playing in any multi-hit deck. And then, if you can regrowth Rupture Strike, or if you can play it multiple times, it is doubling the amount of powerful you have each time. So that gets out of hand very quickly. I don't know if it's better than... I think it's probably going to be trickier to use as a dedicated, you're only going for this as your win, than like an increasing stab would be. But it's also going to fit seamlessly into any deck that is using runes or powerful already. Any multi-hit deck is going to get a lot of value out of it. So I think it can do a lot of work. It can be... I think it is a card that has a very high potential that you will almost never reach, that can lead to you feeling like it is an underwhelming card. But I think my point is, it is a card that reads like a S plus amazing nonsense overpowered card when you start imagining like what you could do with it. And then in reality, it's more like a B plus, solid role player in the right decks. But a B plus is still a B plus. It's a decent grade. You're still totally fine with it. It will still do solid work for you in a lot of decks. It just will rarely quite steal the show the way that you might hope it will. Other cards. So Adaptative Spell. Oh, to finish the other thought on Rupture Strike though is, the other problem that it will sometimes have is that, like, if you had a lot of powerful already in your multi-hit deck, then you already had a lot of powerful in your multi-hit deck. Yes, Rupture Strike further increased the damage you were doing, but you were already winning. So you didn't need to win more. You won. You did it. But I think that it does solid enough work even when you're only at 2 powerful to be entirely reasonable. So, other new cards. Adaptative Spell used to be called Adaptative Blast, and it did something fairly different. It was deal a low amount of damage to the first 2 enemies if the last card you played was a skill, and deal an even lower amount of damage to all enemies if the last card you played was a spell. Now it has 3 modes. Deal 5x2 damage to all enemies if your last card played this turn was a spell. You draw 3 if it was a skill, and you gain 7 mana if it was a mana. So that's 3 possible modes: 5x2 damage to all enemies, draw 3, or gain 7 mana. So really, in practice, that's not gain 7, it's gain 3 mana because you paid 4 for Adaptative Spell. But the important thing to note is that makes this a card that is a mana or card draw, depending on what you need. Yeah, I can also do AoE damage, but that's not really why you're taking it. You're playing it because it is 2 of the most valuable things in the game, and it is a solid rate for both of them, because 3 mana, just straight up plus 3 mana, that's above our baseline for a mana card. Our baseline bad mana card is you get plus 2 mana. That's kind of the floor of mediocre mana cards, and this is above that. And then it is draw 3 for 4 mana with no downsides, which is also pretty much on par with where you'd expect card draw to be. So both of those are that's a very, very good position to be in for your for a card to be that flexible. And the upgrade is 10x 2 damage to all enemies if your last card played was a spell. Draw 5 if it was a skill. Gain 10 mana if it was a mana. And it's 5 mana to play. So now we're at plus 5 mana or plus 5 cards. And to draw 5 for 5 mana is a screaming deal. And so having a modal card that you can choose every time you draw it, depending on what the hand you're looking at needs, is... Now, the fact that it isn't a mana card does mean that it will be affected by fatigue. It won't always be plus 5 mana depending on how much it is when you draw it. But it will usually be plus some amount of mana. And the fact that in your opening hand you will usually have at least one skill and at least 1 mana in a majority of decks, like, that's just very, very good and flexible. And especially if you're playing like Drophus or Salon and now having a spell so that now you will almost always have a spell either in the form of a Cannon Blast or a Bloodburst, so that if you need the AoE, you can get it. It just completely puts it through the roof. This card, I think, is another one that you're going to put in almost all your decks, not because it is the star of the show, but because it is just going to be very effective at doing what you need, when you need it, every time you draw it, in every deck, all the time. That's great. You gotta love that. The other card on this page is Descent into Madness, which is a card I'm proud of because this is my design. I submitted this one. I'm responsible. Me. So it is 1 mana, you draw 1, and you apply 3 fixed arcane to yourself, and then you double both values. Upgraded version is draw 1 and apply 2 fixed arcane to yourself and double both values. So the first time you play it, if it's upgraded, you draw 1, you take 2 arcane. Second time, so that is literally just a downside. You have done nothing but push yourself towards an explosion for functionally no gain, because you've drawn 1, but you would have, if this wasn't in your deck, you would have drawn 1 anyway. The second time you play it, is 0 mana to draw 2 cards and apply 4 fixed arcane to yourself, which now you're up a card and you're only taking 4 arcane to yourself. That's nothing. That's just extra free card draw. That's great. And then the third time you play it, you're going to draw 4 and you're going to apply 8 fixed arcane to yourself. And like, that's a Mystic Ritual for free. That's paying no mana for a Mystic Ritual. I love Mystic Ritual. Yeah, you might explode at that point, but it's fine. It's fine. You're paying 0 mana to draw 4 cards. Why wouldn't you just be fine taking 10 damage for that? And then the next time, you're going to draw 8 cards. You're going to play 16 fixed arcane to yourself, and now you're definitely exploding. But look at all those cards. Look at all those cards. And if you do it again, you're going to draw 16 cards. Well, you're going to draw up to 10 because you can only draw up to 10. The maximum hand size is 10. And you're going to play 32 arcane to yourself. And now you're going to explode at least twice. But you drew a full hand of cards. And the next time you're going to play 64 arcane to yourself. And you're going to blow up 3 or 4 times. No, it's fine. Trust me. Trust me, it's fine. Yes, I know. You just took 30 to 40 damage. But you drew a full hand of cards for free. You can deal with 30 to 40 damage. So this card is a bit tricky to evaluate because there is that sweet spot there in that second, third, fourth time you play it in a fight, especially like that third and fourth time you play it in a fight, it is amazing. The first time you play it, it is bad. The 5th time you play it, it starts getting suicidal. And the 6th+ time you play it, you are becoming ashamed of your words and deeds as you explode. It is a really interesting and fun card. I haven't played with it as much as I would like because it is a card that you really do need to be consistently redrawing through your deck. And I am, like I mentioned, lazy about removing stuff from my decks. So I keep not running it because a combination of the epic slots are packed and I couldn't quite fit it. And knowing that if I do put it in my deck, I won't cut enough cards to make it good. But I think it is a very powerful card in the right deck, in the right hands, and a very powerful threat to the player in the wrong hands, which are probably mine. So I like the design. I think it's a really fun card. I hope you guys enjoy it. I should probably mention I am not actually a dev. I am just a very enthusiastic volunteer beta tester. But the dev does take card suggestions sometimes, and so that is how a card that I designed is in the game. Anyway, I think it's a lot of fun. I think you guys will enjoy it. I enjoy it. I haven't played with it as much as I would like, but I need to play with it more because it is just such a cool card. I like it a lot. Other new cards. These are random damage cards. So Bombardment is very literally a random damage card. It is 6 mana. You deal 2 damage 8 times to a random enemy. And to be clear, each time it could be a different enemy. Unless there's only one enemy, in which case it will hit that enemy because there's only the one. But it is, so this is basically 6 mana for 2x8 damage, but it's potentially spread out across all enemies, which is interesting. This is obviously very good with powerful because you get, the extra damage for every hit will be more powerful based on your powerful. This is potentially very good with runes. It is not particularly, it doesn't compare that well to things like Aether Storm or even Tempest Strike in a lot of cases as an AoE tool. Because if you have Aether Storm, so Bombardment Plus is 5 mana, deal 3 damage 8 times to a random enemy. So if you have an Aether Storm Plus, which is 3 mana, deal 4x4 damage to all enemies, and there are 2 enemies, then Aether Storm is 2 mana. Aether Storm Plus is cheaper for more damage. That's hitting the same number of times total. That's going to be more consistent. But against single target bosses like the dragons in Area 2 or the Area 3 bosses, Bombardment can be a bit more appealing because Aether Storm will always just be those 4 hits to each enemy, whereas Bombardment can be 8 hits to a single enemy, which can be very, very, very good with runes or powerful. I don't think I like it overall, although it does have a sweet, unique visual effect of like these fireballs raining down from the sky, which is amazing. I recommend playing it at least once just to see that. But in general, I would say that Bombardment is a card that is fun to look at and fun to think about, but not going to be worth including for the majority of decks, even if you're a multi-hit deck. Also, the fact that it is 6 mana, like multi-hit decks tend to be kind of pinched on mana a lot of the time. And I think that you'd be better off just using like Fragmented Blast and then upgrading your Fragmented Blast, which is going to already hit the first enemy 6 times. I think you're just going to want Frag Blast Plus over Bombardment Plus the vast majority of times, and Frag Blast goes in your starting deck. So, yeah. Lightning Call. 5 mana, deal 30 damage to any enemy. 5 mana, deal 30 damage to any enemy if it's shocked. Lightning Call Plus is 6 mana, deal 45 damage to any enemy if it's shocked. And 30 damage to any enemy if it's shocked sounds very good, because if the enemy is shocked, then you're going to get a lot of damage. The downside is you've got to be very dedicated to the bit, because if the enemy you want to hit isn't shocked, then this does literal actual nothing, which is kind of a bummer. There's another card called it's called Mystic Outburst that is 5 mana. You deal 25 damage to any enemy, and you apply 6 fixed arcane to yourself. And so when you play Mystic Outburst, yes, you have the risk of exploding, but you have no risk of it being stuck in your hand, unable to do literally anything. And that seems pretty important for a trade-off to me. I have done a couple runs with Lightning Call. Like, you can make it work, but I will tend not to recommend it, especially because part of having like shock as your main thing is you can't have that many damaging cards. And so if you're using Lightning Call, you may not have other damaging cards. If you don't have other damaging cards, you might struggle to deal with Drakes and other evasive things. Uh, and Lightning Call doesn't do well in multiples. It's high damage, but it's like less than a singularity, so it's not. And like 5 mana for 30 damage is a great deal, but it's not an insane deal. In that you can get like 20-ish damage for 5 mana with minimal downside, and then at that point the question becomes, is it like, because I think Spirit Bolt is like 18 damage for 5 mana, and you get the Spirit if you critical, which is just an added bonus. But like, so your question has to be, yes, 30 damage is a lot more than 18, but does that make up for the number of times where you will draw it and you just can't do anything with it? And I don't think that's going to happen that much. I think that Lightning Call will be... It goes back to the thing I was talking about with the other shot card, where it's like, this is a card that is, I think, more than the other one, doing solid work in the deck that it is good in, but is very bad in decks that's not good. And I think that Lightning Call is going to be a card that is harder to make work than Spark in terms of the amount of effort that you need. And it is fairly replaceable in that there are a lot of other ways to do lots of damage, do big hits with single cards, which reduces the value of having an effect like this that like has a big downside attached to it. So something to consider. It's not the worst. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either, and I would tend to avoid using it. And if you do find yourself using it, make certain that not only are you able to consistently play it, but that you're not passing up a lot of damage. Because the other thing is, like, if you're saving your shocked for this, if that means that you aren't playing other cards, then you are functionally, it is costing you damage from other cards you could have been playing instead, that you aren't, because you need to save that shock so that this card isn't dead. So, other cards. Aid. Aid is 4 mana. You give 10 shield, tough 1, and purity 1 to any ally. So this is notable because it lets you target a specific ally of your choice. That ally cannot be you. It has to be a summon. This card exists as a way to say, if you are playing a dedicated ally deck, this exists to ensure that you'll be able to safeguard like a paladin shock turret. They're not called shock turrets anymore. They're just turrets, I think. The automated turret, whatever it's called. Being able to protect one of those against enemy debuffs and enemy AoE attacks. 8+ is 14 shield, tough 2, and purity 2 to any ally. So this is a card that is kind of awkward because it's a lot of mana and you only need it in some fights. So it's already a very narrow card because you only want it in summoning decks. And you only want it in summoning decks that are for some fights. Like if you end up just like not rolling the fights where it's most relevant, it won't do anything. It doesn't do anything to protect you. And it's a decent amount of mana. And it won't necessarily always save the ally. If the ally has already been cursed, that ally is doomed. You can't do anything about it. That ally's gonna die, gonna get got. So I think it's kind of an awkward card to find a spot for. I don't know where I would run it, but it is the sort of card that you might want in your card pool because there's only like one other, like Spirit Helmet is the other card that like gives AoE shield to all your allies, and so like you'll put Aid in the card pool of your summon deck because like you need one of the two in order to build up your summons at all against certain fights, especially Watch for the Swarm, because those unstable shadow bursts will just otherwise tear through your guy, and it's annoying. But you're not super thrilled with Aid, I think, most of the time. It's a card that you are running and hoping that you don't need, and you're kind of resenting that it's in your deck the whole time it's in your deck. But sometimes you need it, and it'll be fine. Hooray! Garrote. Garrote? However it's pronounced. Garrote, I think. Gives bleed 15 to the first enemy. And that's it. 3 mana, give bleed 15 to the first enemy. So it's basically 15 delayed damage. It is all up front, unlike Deadly Injection, which is the 10 poison. The downside is it has to be to the first enemy. I've been informed we're getting more bleed synergy later. That this is kind of a plant for that future bleed synergy we're getting in version 6000. But we're not there yet. So looking at just what we've got now, all I can say is this sure is a delayed damage card. I don't know why I don't know where I would use it. I can't really imagine any decks where you're super thrilled to have it. If you want damage, there are usually going to be better options, I think. I think like part of it is like there's not that much bleed synergy right now. I guess maybe if you really need a way to beat rock golems, this kind of gets there eventually. I guess. I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about it because like it's just kind of a whatever card. All right. Other new cards. I think this is the last two that I have in. Yeah. So, Shield Stratagem is it's Triple Strike. Don't you recognize it? Triple Strike is no longer in the game. Slash moved up to take the Triple Strike slot. This took over, or Slash is now 3x3 damage for 3 mana, which is what Triple Strike used to be. And now instead of Triple Strike, we have this in the default card pool, Shield Stratagem. And Shield Stratagem is 4 mana for a strike that says deal 14 damage to the first enemy if you are tough. Otherwise, gain 10 shield and tough 2. So this is a really interesting card because tough is a very powerful buff. This is the only source of tough in the default card pool, not counting monster cards. But it is such a fun puzzle of a card to play because it is like 14 damage for 4 mana is a pretty good rate, especially for a common. 10 shield and tough 2 is a very good rate for a common on a defensive card. I'm very happy paying 5 mana for Heavy Stand, which is 10 shield and tough 2. The downside is you only have some control over which of those two you're getting each time you play it. And there will be times where you desperately need to get in damage, and you can't. And there will be times where you desperately need shield. You can't get that either. Well, you'll get one of the two, but you can't get the one that you want at the time you want it. And so that can be a problem. But in exchange, you're getting a screaming deal on both modes for a common. So I think it's a really fun and interesting card to play around. The fact that it's a strike is relevant because like in Catan, it will throw you to spell mode, which can be relevant. It isn't a skill for Resolute Focus or Deft Focus for Enna, which is very relevant. It is a strike for Arms Race, which is also in the default card pool. It's a really interesting card. Like that 14 damage is a lot of damage, but if you only have one copy of it, you're going to have trouble lining it up as damage. If you have other sources of tough, you may have problems using it to get shield. So you may not be able to rely on it as a shield card after you pick up like a toughen from a Forest Guardian. It's a really interesting card. I like it a lot. I think that it is a card that is very easy to mess yourself up with while playing. But it's really cool. I like it. I think it's fun to play with. I think that it has the power to be worth trying. I think there's a card that you put in your deck, and then you take out of your deck, and then you put in your deck, and then you take out of your deck, and then you put in your deck, and then I don't know whether it ends up in or out. But it's certainly worth playing with. It certainly does. It's certainly a card that is at least an option for a lot of decks I build, which is always important to me for deck building, is having cards where I don't know if I want them or not, because that means that they are actually providing me with interesting choices. It's not just like, oh, yes, I definitely want this, or no, I definitely don't. It's, well, I want this effect, but is this how I want to get it? Tenderize used to be like 4 mana for like 10 damage, and you give vulnerable 2 to the first enemy, which was pretty boring. Now, it's 3 mana, deal 2 damage to the first enemy, per rank of vulnerable it has, and then you give it vulnerable 1. Upgraded its 3 damage per rank of vulnerable, and then give it vulnerable 2. So this is a build around. If you're putting Tenderize in your deck, you're putting 2 copies of Tenderize in your deck, and you're building the Tenderize deck, which is really interesting. It's in some ways like a weird increasing stab variant. It makes you care about... Normally, there is no benefit to having multiple vulnerable, but now you're suddenly all about upgrading your Haunted Memory so that you can get 5 stacks of vulnerable out of it, which is ridiculous. I like Tenderize Plus. I like New Tenderize a lot. I think it's a lot of fun to build around. I have recorded a run with a more powerful version. It got nerfed several times because it used to give vulnerable 2 first. It used to be 4 mana, give vulnerable 2, and then deal 3 damage to the first enemy per rank of vulnerable it has, which was ridiculous because it just did so much damage so quickly, especially on Marley, where you'd be getting criticals. It still does a lot of damage, just slightly less damage and slightly less ridiculous. It is a fairly straightforward build around. Doesn't have the most complicated thinking required to make it work, but it is a card about swinging a hammer at a thing over and over again until it is soft and mushy meat. So I don't know why you would expect complexity from that. But yeah, it's fun. It's good. It's simple. It's straightforward. It does what you would want it to do. It is a card that promises you that if you put enough vulnerable cards in, you will get to smash the things with the hammer. And it lives up to that promise. And what more can you ask for? All right. New character cards. I'm not going to get into the monster cards here because, oh boy, I should have known I was going to talk forever. And yet, here we are. Yeah, there are only 2 character cards. There are a few other character cards that were changed, but there are only 2 that are really new. So I'm going to start with Blood Tide because it's fairly straightforward. Blood Tide is now 5 mana, deal 8 damage to any enemy and 4 damage to all enemies, and you gain 1 mana per card in your hand. Drophus is pretty good at filling her hand with Blood Bursts. Oh, and the upgrade is 7 mana, 12 damage to any enemy, 6 damage to all enemies, which, to be clear, will hit the enemy that you choose twice for 12 plus 6. And then just all the other enemies will only take 6. And then the upgrade gives you 2 mana per card in your hand. So the break-even point on the upgrade is if you have 4 other cards in hand, Blood Tide Plus gives you an advantage, whereas you need 6 other cards for Blood Tide to be positive on mana. Which means, even though Blood Tide Plus is that much more expensive, it's going to be much easier for it to end up netting you mana. And Blood Tide Plus is effectively a mana card. And because it's gold, you can always upgrade it immediately. And it is not just a mana card. It is a pretty good mana card. If you play it with 8 cards in your hand, for example, it is plus 9. I can't do math. 8 times 2 is 16. Minus 7 is 9. It's 9 mana. Well, if you... 7 mana, because if you had 8 cards before you played the Blood Tide. Which, again... Drophus tends to be pretty good at filling her hand with Blood Bursts and other cards. And so, yeah, Blood Tide is damage plus mana. And it's not amazing damage, but it can be amazing mana. And getting any damage while gaining mana is pretty solid. Unarmed combo. So Blood Tide, it's just good. You just put it in decks. It's one of those cards that, like, is never exciting, but is always doing very good work, so whatever. Unarmed combo. In a card. This used to be the terrible Unarmed Strike. It used to be 2 mana, you give vulnerable 2 to the first enemy if it had no shield, and you do 2x2 damage, which was abysmal. Like Lacerating Strike is just so much better than that was. But now, it is 3 mana, Unarmed combo, strike, deal 4 damage to the first enemy if it has no shield, 4 if it's vulnerable, 4 if it's weak, and 4 if it's frail. So I mentioned earlier that Inna has this weak, vulnerable, frail sub-theme. The other card that's relevant here is Investigate, which gives you tools for enemies that have those. But Unarmed combo is up to 4x4 for 3 mana, which seems pretty good which is very good for a common. Inna has tools that will help you with vulnerable and weak. A lot of enemies will just already have no shields. You'll just always get that. Duels are kind of the fly in the ointment. Duels and if your Area 1 boss is Demented Munchroom, you're very sad because now Demented Munchroom just starts with 30 shield on it and all of its minions. But aside from that, if you can get Vulnerable and Weak set up, this will do, even with just those two, Vulnerable will make it like +1 damage. So you're doing 5x3 to an enemy that is vulnerable and weak. And that's not bad. If you're Mighty, it's like 6x3, which is pretty respectable for 3 mana. It got nerfed slightly. It used to be 6 for the first condition, so it would be like 6 plus 4x2. It's now slightly weaker. It's still going to do reasonable, respectable work. It's just not going to blow people away as much. But, you know, it is a very good step up from where it was before, which was hilariously unplayable. The Frail is the sticking point. Getting Frail on enemies is tricky. There aren't many cards that do it, and it doesn't have any tools that do it. She does now have Improvised Strike, now does apply Frail. So you do have that. You have the Deathfrost Storm we talked about earlier. There are a few monster cards that will help. There is Corrupted Roots, which is a generic card, but it's not in the default pool, but it is a common. So like there are ways to do it. But I would generally say that if you're playing this, you can expect the enemy to meet up to 2 of the 3 debuff conditions. It'll be only 4x2 damage some amount of the time, but so I don't understand the idea of playing Anna aggressively, so I am underrating it for that reason, but I don't think it's bad. All right, so I was going to go on and talk about the new monster cards in this video, but I'm at nearly an hour and 50 minutes. I'm over an hour. I'm about an hour and 47 minutes. You've got a timestamp. You can see that. So my throat is tired. I am done for the day. I'm going to record part 2 tomorrow. I'll see you guys then. I hope at least one person watched more than 2 minutes of this, and I hope that person came away informed. If that person is still listening, subscribe. You too can join my growing YouTube empire. I have dozens, literally dozens of people who subscribe and literally ones of people who watch many of my videos. Some of my videos have as many as 5 viewers. You could be one of them. You are one of them. You're viewing it right now or listening to it. Anyway, toodles.